Pope Francis responds to the refugee crisis head-on. The U.S. prepares to welcome the Pope, and there are new rules on how to get an annulment. Hello and welcome to the first episode of Vatican Connections for Season 4. We've got a lot to talk about this week. There's been a lot going on over the summer. But first, we're just getting ready for the Pope's visit to Cuba and the US, but already the Vatican has announced yet another papal trip. Pope Francis will visit Africa in November, and the itinerary for the trip looks like this. From November 25th to 27th, he will be in Kenya. Then he will be in Uganda from November 27th to 29th and the Central African Republic from November 29th to 30th. And we'll have all the details as they are released. Pope Francis has changed the procedure for getting a marriage annulment. We'll be looking at the new process in depth a little bit later on in the program, but essentially under this new system, when neither spouse contests the annulment, only one tribunal will have to rule on the case. If that tribunal finds that the marriage was not valid to begin with, and neither spouse wants to appeal, a decree of nullity will be granted. Every diocese will be responsible for naming a tribunal and a judge. Pope Francis said the process should be free. Now, the new process was created by an 11-member commission that the Pope created after the last synod. He also had 4 independent canonists review the new rules before accepting them. They take effect December 9th. We've been talking a lot about migrants and refugees arriving in Europe for some time here on Vatican Connections, just as Pope Francis has been talking about the issue. Now that the situation is perceived as a crisis, Pope Francis has gone one step further. He's called on every parish in Europe to take in one refugee family, and he's leading by example. The 2 parishes located in Vatican City, St. Peter's Basilica and St. Anne's Parish, will each take in one refugee family. The Vatican is working with Caritas in Lampedusa and Agrigento to identify 2 families. Parishes and dioceses in Europe and beyond are responding similarly. Vienna's Cardinal Christoph Schönborn announced his archdiocese could house 1,000 refugees in church buildings, and several North American dioceses have announced efforts to sponsor families to come to North America. Of course, besides these 2 major announcements, there's not much else coming out of the Vatican, but with good reason. The Pope is preparing for a 10-day trip to Cuba and the US. To start things off, he held a virtual audience with groups in Texas, Los Angeles, and Chicago.
Su Santidad es un gran honor estar con usted aquí en el Vaticano, y muchas gracias por su tiempo hoy.
Hosted by the U.S. news network ABC, Pope Francis was introduced to a single mother in Los Angeles who was forced to live in a shelter with her 2 daughters, a child in Chicago who has been bullied because of a skin disorder, and a young man in Texas who had to give up on going to college because he's an undocumented immigrant. Pope Francis said it was important for him to meet people so he could better understand their struggles and better offer support. Now, while he's in the U.S., the Pope will visit Washington, D.C., New York, and Philadelphia. Catholic News Service has this look at one of the groups he will meet while in Washington.
Well, I'm working on the dinner service, so it's with St. Maria's Meals, and we provide meals to homeless people or disadvantaged people every Wednesday night. And we expect about anywhere between 250 and 500 people per night. So we're expecting a big crowd. They're already lining up.
Pope Francis is going to be here, almost where I'm standing right here, right now. Just a few steps away. Be here to bless this program, bless the people who come for service, and bless our volunteers, and bless our staff. He'll be here on the 24th of September, so we can't wait till he comes and blesses our efforts to reach out and take care of the poor. And the bottom line is, for him, is he's coming because He truly believes our ministry, our call, our church is called to take care of those in need, the vulnerable, and we're going to do it with him that day.
My experience being homeless, it's like you're locked outside of the world, you know. You treat it lower than the footprint, you know. It is very hard. It's hard to keep a job. It's hard to keep a stable housing because you don't have no place to clean yourself up at.
This program began almost 3 years ago now when we had some people who came to us and said, is it possible to give people a meal to eat in the evenings? The sadness we have is in our shelters, we have about 1,800 beds every night. Many of those beds are called low barrier shelters, meaning there's no barriers to get in. And the food there is, while it's not bad, it's not enough. And the money we get from the government to help people is not very substantial. So it's actually $1.80 per night per person. So you can't serve a great meal there. So we serve this meal, which is home cooked, generally done either by our own team or by volunteers. It's like chicken sandwiches and potatoes and salad and desserts. It's a real good, solid meal. They love coming here because they get a really good meal. At least Wednesday nights, it's like maybe our old Sunday dinners we were home for kids. Just a meal to get a good meal once a week.
You know, and people will go through the line multiple times. We don't skimp on our portions, so we really try to get people well fed on Wednesday evenings. Pope Francis hopefully will be quite impressed with what he sees and how engaged the Catholic Charities is in the community here.
Mighty God bless us, Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
It was a good trip.
Pope Francis's new norms for the annulment process have made headlines this week, and joining me now is Father Alexander Laschuk. He is an associate judicial vicar with the Toronto Regional Metropolitan Marriage Tribunal, that's a long name, to tell us more about what these norms are and how they affect people. Thank you so much for making time to be here. So I think, first of all, what makes a Catholic marriage invalid?
Yeah, basically, a marriage can be invalid for one of three reasons, and that can be, the most simplest would be a defective form, and that means that Catholics are obliged to follow Catholic form, so they have to get married unless they have permission otherwise, to get married in a Catholic church in front of a minister who has the faculties, who will witness their marriage. And so that would be the most basic. So if I'm a Catholic who gets married at City Hall, first problem. Second would be an undispensed impediment. So if somebody has, vows in a religious order and they try and get married, that's not going to count, unfortunately.
Right.
And finally, and this is when most people speak about an annulment, this is what they're talking about, this would be a defect of consent. So that means that at the time of consent, their intention was something not in line with what the church understands as marriage, or perhaps they were prevented by some psychological reason from making a valid consent, because it has to be a free human action, and that sometimes does not happen.
So what kinds of things would the church consider like impeding you from making that?
Well, for example, not everyone today, Joe in the pew, might not believe that marriage is an exclusive relationship between one man and one woman. They might not believe that that is ordered to children, especially some older people get married and that's not happening for them.
Right.
Some people might not intend divorce, but that's there if I need it, which again is not really what the church says about a marriage. Or perhaps there's some kind of parental pressure or reverential fear. Their parents are saying you have to do this, or there's a pregnancy and they have to do that. Or some people, in more extreme cases, might have a psychological reason that they're just incapable of fulfilling marital obligations. So if they have some kind of psychological disorder, that their narcissistic personality disorder, and they can't even appreciate their spouse's needs, there's going to be a problem there too. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
Okay, so then, until this document came out, what was the process for getting a marriage annulled?
Well, basically, the most basic thing would be that somebody would come to the tribunal, and that would be usually through their pastor. They talk to their pastor, and the pastor would refer them to the tribunal. And the first step is always to fill out a petition, which is libellus, which would say a brief statement of the facts, and the judge is supposed to read that and then determine whether there is, we could call it a fumus bonus juris, which is a sense, a smoke of law, that there's an idea that there is some truth to this, there could be a problem here, and then if the tribunal is competent, and it was more restricted previously, then they would accept that case. From there, it would go to interview the parties. Well, first we'd have to cite the respondent, who has a right to participate, so the former spouse. We have to find them. cite them.
Right.
Sometimes in competency, we have to talk to them first before we can become competent, depending where they lived. For example, if the respondent lived in another country, but all the witnesses were here, we had to ask their permission first before doing the case here, which is now changed. And that's been a challenge for us in a place like Toronto with a very international population.
Right.
So we have to cite the respondent and inform them that this is happening and that they have the right to participate. They don't have to if they don't want to, but they have that right. And once they've made that decision and the petitioner and the respondent are interviewed, there'll be a formulation of the doubt. And the formulation of the doubt happens after the citation of the respondent, which is when we decide on what ground does it seem this marriage is null. And that's the question the tribunal will try to answer. So is this marriage between Billy and Sally invalid because of force and fear or lack of discretion or whatever? And the tribunal will then try and establish proofs. The judge or his assistant will interview witnesses, perhaps gather evidence, prenuptial files, maybe medical reports, psychological reports, perhaps use an expert, a psychological expert that we use regularly who can testify. I mean, I don't have a degree in psychology, so I'll find somebody who does those kinds of things to establish the facts. And then once all that is gathered, we again inform the parties who have the right to read anything that they don't know about. So they can read the witness testimonies, they can read their former spouse's testimony, and they can go from there. And then the defender of the bond, and if there are advocates, but always last the defender of the bond. The defender of the bond is who speaks for the marriage itself. He argues or she argues for the marriage, would have their say. And can make some, these people were 25 years of age, they had doctorates, in chemistry, they indicated on the prenuptial file that they had, the right intentions that the church intends, and they would make reasonable objections to invalidity. And from there it goes to the judges, either generally three judges, or sometimes in Canada we could have a single clerical judge, and if there's three, two of them had to be clerics. Who would then make a decision about the process, and then after that, if nobody appeals, it had to be appealed anyways ex officio to the Court of Second Instance in Ottawa.
That is a really long process. I can see why some people might be intimidated by that. So with this motu proprio, with the two motu proprios, one for the Latin Rite, one for the Eastern rites, and we'll deal with that in a moment, but with the new norms that Pope Francis has implemented, how does that change?
Well, I'd say that the biggest thing is that there is a simplified process available now. So in cases, these will be a minority of cases, and apparently some news have said 45 days, and that's not going to apply to all cases, unfortunately. For cases where we call manifest invalidity, so it's very obvious, and we have these cases sometimes where it's very obvious there's a problem here. And sometimes the marriage, we've had them where they never even spent a day together, or they might have spent 2 weeks together, or things like that. So, I mean, these do happen. And if both parties petition, now that's new in the law, that we can use an abbreviated process in the law. And so that will be much quicker.
So both spouses have to
petition, or at least the respondent has to at least say they don't object to the process. So that's required to have the most abbreviated process. So that's a big change. That didn't even exist in the law before. We can call it a short formal process. And then there's the regular formal process, which has been simplified. The big thing is the elimination of the double conforming sentence. So we no longer have to go on every single case to the Court of Second Instance, unless it's appealed by one of the parties or the defender of the bond. So if we make a decision here in Toronto and after 15 days nobody appeals it, that's it. We don't have to send that to another tribunal where another 3 judges will look at it.
What hasn't changed?
Well, certainly the Holy Father has again emphasized the indissolubility of a ratified and consummated marriage. So marriage between 2 baptized persons that is consummated is, assumed to be valid in the Catholic Church. It is dissolved by no human power other than death. That's been the consistent teaching of the Holy Father. The basic procedure has remained a judicial procedure. There was a lot of talk amongst certain people in the church lately that maybe we could go to a oral or a pastoral solution, different things that the Holy Father, again, Pope Francis has said several times in this document itself that there's a reason we have to use this judicial procedure, because we need to both protect the rights of the parties involved, we have to protect the sacraments, and we also have to establish facts, and that's difficult sometimes.
And another thing that came up was the costs. A lot of people have cited the cost, or the length of time and the cost, and Pope Francis has repeatedly said this process should be free. Talk to us about that, because I understand that's also been misunderstood.
Yeah, I think certainly it's the Catholic Church is a big organization, and the dioceses are very different from each other.
Right.
And what we've seen in the new norms is actually a lot of practices of North American tribunals have been now put into the universal law.
Okay.
So there are parts of the world, for example, where fee structures were much greater than they are here in North America, because, for example, you had to hire a person with a degree in canon law to argue your case before a tribunal, and he had set fees and these kinds of things. So that was a challenge. But even in the Canadian context, the Archdiocese of Toronto is a very different state financially than other dioceses. So some tribunals, for example, in Toronto, does not have a fee meaning that when we get your application, we expect X number of dollars.
Right, pay this much at this point, this much
Yeah.
for this, okay.
I mean, in Toronto we have a recommended donation, but if you don't give it, that doesn't impact your thing at all. But there are tribunals, including in Rome, at the Holy See itself, the Roman Rota, where there are set fees. So, for example, in the United States, if you appeal a case to the Roman Rota, there is a set fee that the diocese is assessed, which is generally passed on to the parties. I think.
Okay, and that's just a fee because the reality is that they have to hire
Tribunal
people.
ministers should be remunerated for their work. Lights cost money, stamps cost money, photocopies cost money, everything costs,
Okay, so that's a tough one.
Yeah.
That's a tough one to weigh out. Now, I mentioned before there were two documents that actually came out simultaneously. One applies to the Latin Rite Church, one applies to the Eastern Catholic churches. You're familiar with both of these. You are a Ukrainian Catholic priest. So you're very familiar with both processes. So tell us about how this process changes now for the Eastern Catholic churches.
Well, certainly the Eastern Catholic churches follow the same basic procedure that exists for the Latin Church, recognizing that there is one teaching on the sacrament of marriage. And that would be an important distinction between the Eastern Catholic churches and the Eastern Orthodox churches, which have a different understanding and different procedures.
Okay.
But for the Eastern Catholic churches, they have a separate code of canon law. So we have a Latin code and we have an Eastern code, the code of canons of the Eastern churches, and they have their own canon. So the most fundamental reason would be to respect that there's a different law for the Eastern churches and to promulgate a document that also changes those canons. Now, in the last revision of canon law in 2005, Dignitas Connubii, that did not happen. And the law of the Eastern churches was not revised at all.
Okay.
So the Eastern churches had an interesting state where some new norms that came out in 2005 did not apply to the Eastern Catholic churches, and they were using the old norms. There are some differences, though, mainly in the hierarchical constitution of the church. So, for example, there are 3 tribunals that are possible to decide a decision. In the Latin Church, there would usually be the Diocesan Tribunal, the Metropolitan Tribunal, Appeal Tribunal, and a third instance tribunal, which, generally speaking, is the Sacred Roman Rota in Rome. And in the Eastern churches, though, in the patriarchal territory, the Synod of Bishops is able to establish a third instance tribunal. So recognizing that there is that level of the Synod of Bishops that provides governance for the Church and respecting that within the tradition of the Eastern churches, which doesn't exist in the Latin Church.
Right. The bishops.
Yeah.
This is, you mentioned the bishops. There was much mention made about how these new norms put the bishop more in the center of this, give the bishop more power. Every diocese will have to have a tribunal and a judge. Does that mean that the bishop wasn't part of this before?
I think that really depends on the diocese. Certainly in the previous law, the bishop was reminded repeatedly that he is, the supreme judge of his diocese, that he is to take care to establish this. And unfortunately, what we see in some dioceses is the bishop has appointed a judicial vicar, and he does not want to know what's going on in that tribunal. And the bishop now is explicitly in the law the judge for those cases, whereas previously he had the option to be, and certainly that does happen in some dioceses where we have bishops who act as judges, that they have a degree in canon law, but now it's right directly in the law, even if they're not a canonist. Right?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us.
I'm glad to be here.
Great.
Right.
Time to take a look now at what Pope Francis has been doing this week. On Monday, Pope Francis met with the bishops of Portugal, ending their ad limina visit. He asked them to stay committed to a constant and methodical evangelization to ensure that young people know how to respond to Christ and maintain the well-being of the country. On Wednesday, Pope Francis held the general audience, and he continued his catechesis on the family, this time focusing on the link between the family and the Christian community and the role of parishes. CNS has more.
Una Chiesa davvero secondo il Vangelo non può che avere la forma di una casa accogliente, con le porte aperte, sempre. Le chiese, le parrocchie, le istituzioni con le porte chiuse non si devono chiamare chiese, si devono chiamare musei. Rafforzare il legame tra famiglia e comunità cristiana è oggi indispensabile e urgente. Certo, c'è bisogno di una fede generosa per ritrovare l'intelligenza e il coraggio per rinnovare questa alleanza. Le famiglie a volte si tirano indietro, dicendo di non essere all'altezza, ma nessuno è degno, nessuno è all'altezza, nessuno ha le forze. Senza la grazia di Dio non potremo fare nulla. Tutto ci viene dato, gratuitamente dato. E il Signore non arriva mai in una nuova famiglia senza fare qualche miracolo. Sì, il Signore, se ci mettiamo nelle sue mani, ci fa compiere miracoli, ma quei miracoli di tutti i giorni, quando c'è il Signore lì in quella famiglia.
On Thursday, Pope Francis had quite a busy day. First, he met with Archbishop Luigi Bonazzi. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because Archbishop Bonazzi is the papal nuncio to Canada, and he's been on the program before. Then Pope Francis met with Sheikh Jaber al-Mubarak al-Hamad al-Sabah, the Prime Minister of Kuwait. And after that meeting, the Vatican's Department for Relations with States and Kuwait's Ministry of Foreign Affairs signed a memorandum of understanding. Now, this memorandum should strengthen bilateral relations and help with future collaboration between the two states. Finally, on Thursday, Pope Francis met with bishops who had just finished taking what's often referred to as the new bishops course at the Vatican. Basically, it's a series of seminars with different dicasteries for all of the bishops who have been appointed in the last year. Pope Francis told the new bishops their role is to be witnesses to the good news of Jesus' resurrection, be a lifelong teacher, and a missionary going wherever the good news is needed. Normally at this point in the program, we look at who's resigned and who's been nominated over the past week, but this time we're going a little bit further back to see what's happened over the summer. In July, Father Robert Barron, the rector of Mundelein Seminary in Illinois and the founder of Word on Fire Ministry, was named one of 3 auxiliary bishops of Los Angeles. He was ordained in September along with Fathers Joseph Brennan and David O'Connell. All 3 are now bishops for LA. And there is a new papal nuncio to Switzerland and Liechtenstein. Archbishop Thomas Gullickson was named to that post over the summer, and he actually just took over this week. He was previously the nuncio to Ukraine. He is originally from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And bringing us to this week, Joliet, Quebec has a new bishop. Bishop Raymond Poisson will lead that diocese. Now, he had been serving as an auxiliary bishop in Saint Jerome. Well, that's it for this edition of Vatican Connections. Join us again next time as we prepare for the papal visit to Cuba and the United States. As always, you can follow us on Twitter or check our blog for regular updates. Until then, thanks for watching and see you next time.